Hello everybody, this is International Master Sam Shankland, and today I'm going to continue my lectures on the Ruy-Lopez and its main themes. So last time we looked at sort of the main kind of positions where black will play, where both sides will go for this structure after bishop a4, knight f6, castles, bishop e7, rook e1, b5, bishop b3. And we looked at structures where, in general, white would have c3 and d4 played, and black would have d6, and talking about the pawn tension and, when white would usually play d5 and who that would favor. So today we're going to look at a couple of the more offbeat lines of the Ruy-Lopez. I'm going to start out with the Berlin Wall, knight f6, because this is a very popular opening. There's a couple ways of playing it. Black can play it for a draw, and black can play it for a win. So white's best way to play is castling, knight d4, knight e4, d4, knight d6, bishop c6, dc6, de5, knight f5, and queen takes d8, king takes d8. So here, this is basically the starting position of the Berlin defense. And as I alluded to in the previous video, both sides have their obvious trumps. Black, in the long run, has the bishop pair, which is a big advantage in an open position. But in the short run, he's underdeveloped, his king can't castle, and also white has a good solid pawn majority on the king side. If you see this pawn on e5, f2, g2, and h2 against just the 3 pawns of black. Meanwhile, black's majority, these 4 against white's 3, is not going to be able to do anything because the black's doubled c-pawns. So play usually will continue something like knight c3. And black has a few ways of answering, and there's different plans. Black can play sort of h6, keeping the knight out of g5, and there's a few things that black can try to do. Black can play b6, and let's say bishop e6, and king c8, king b7, trying to find a safe square for his king, and then play moves like bishop e7, and try to centralize his rooks, and maybe start playing on the queen side. White, in the meantime, will probably try to kick this knight on f5 with g4, and then try to move this knight on d4, and then play f4, and really try to push his majority where he's strong. So h6 is a move. There's other plans as well. Knight e7 I've seen many times with many ideas. If knight g5, black can happily meet it with king e8, follow it up with h6. So, for example, white could play f4, h6, and now white's kind of weak on the dark squares, and black can blockade very nicely after, let's say, bishop e6. And if knight e4, well, just let's say b6. And long-term, black is very solid, and it's hard to see how white's really going to push his majority, but the bishop pair could become very important. For example, right now, although it's not threatened, this pawn on a2 is going to be weak. So if white plays some natural-looking moves, like let's say bishop e3, knight f5, or knight d5. Those are also weak squares. But let's say c5 is just to make it so white can play normal moves. If he plays rook ad1, for example, now, he's always going to have to worry about this move bishop takes a2, and then if b3, c4. So oftentimes, white will have to play b3 himself here. But maybe now black will play a5 with the intention of playing a4 and breaking up these white pawns and start to attack them with his active bishops. Also, there's always possibilities of playing bishop f5, let's say b3, bishop f5, and trying to attack this pawn. So one key point is a lot of times white will play a system where he plays, let's say, b3. And now after bishop b4 from black, bishop b2, one common idea, which I don't think is bad at all, is to just take off this knight right now. Because the opposite colored bishops, especially because black has the light squared bishop, means that it's very hard for white to advance his pawns because black's got the e6 square and the f5 square covered so well, and black's banking on white having weak pawns on the light squares in the future. I saw a recent game, or not too recent, I guess about a year ago, a little less, in this variation, where Sergei Ehrenberg, Israeli grandmaster playing the black pieces, defeated our newest American GM-elect, Grandmaster-elect Lev Millman, who was at the time still an IM. And I would definitely encourage you to check that game out for basic understanding of these principles. So another way that black can play is, let's say we get knight e7, rook d1. I don't know if this is exactly theory, but white will try to play something like this. And then white's going to try to play h3, f4, and g4, and try to play f5. So one thing black might do is play something like h5, so that h3, g4 is just never really going to happen. And that's going to make it very hard for white to keep pushing. For example, this position isn't exactly theory, but let's say black plays a6. He wants to play c5, but he doesn't want to let white's knight get to b5. Let's say f4, and now c5. In this position, it might be a little bit risky because white can play knight db5 anyway, and there's a lot of threats now, like checkmate. But so if black plays a preparatory move like bishop d7, it's again hard to see what white's going to do. Let's say bishop e3, c5. Now knight b3, b6. And, black's next moves can play themselves. He'll play, let's say, bishop e6 or bishop c6, and he'll start pushing on the queen side. And it's really hard to see what white's actually doing, although because his pawns are blocked so effectively by black's bind on the light squares. So the Berlin is an extremely rich opening. There's lots of things going on, but in the interest of time, that's basically where I'm going to leave it, because there's other lines of the Lopez that we should be covering. But that's definitely one that's very popular among grandmasters at the top these days, because it's looking like black usually can hold a draw in most variations. So the next variation I'm going to look at is the open Ruy-Lopez, which goes as follows: knight takes e4. And this is sort of like the Berlin, in the sense that black takes a pawn on e4 before he's, I guess, quote-unquote, technically supposed to be able to. But he definitely plays it very differently. It gets to a different kind of position. So white plays d4, and black can't really play e takes d4 because of rook e1. Although there is a funny variation here. If white knows what he's doing, he's in good shape. Black plays d5, knight takes d4, and then bishop d6. So white has to take c6 if he wants anything here. And now black plays bishop takes h2 check. So if you pause your videos, you should probably pause it for a couple minutes to figure this one out, to try to find what white's best response to this move is. I'll let you do that, and then in about 3 seconds, we're going to keep talking. Okay, so I hope you've had a chance to pause your video and think about this. The best move is actually king h1, which is kind of a funky idea, but the point is king f1, now this bishop is no longer attacked. And if king takes h2, well then black plays queen h4 check, king g1, and queen takes f2 is just a draw. King h2, queen h4, draw. So the main thing that white does after is king h1. And now if black takes on c6, bishop takes c6 check, black's whole position is really falling apart. For example, let's say if king f8, maybe even just rook takes e4. And it's hard to see what black's going to do next. So black in general will play queen h4 here. So this is kind of a frustrating point for white, because it looks like there should be some great discoveries, but there really just aren't. There's no real way for him to make a good knight move that makes serious threats. So the best move for white here is actually rook takes e4. Unfortunately, white does not have time to play a move like queen takes d5, because black will play bishop g3 check and promptly deliver checkmate. For example, bishop g3, king g1, bishop f2, king f1, queen h1, king e2, queen e1, and white is not going to survive. He's already down a lot of material too. So for example, king f3, black can probably even just castle and retain a winning position. So white plays rook takes e4, and now black plays d takes e4, and now white plays queen d8, which would be checkmate, but black still has the queen on h4. Queen takes, knight takes, and then king takes h2. And this ending, while if you just turn on some kind of material counter, it will say black is up material. It's really not true, because white's two pieces are a lot better than black's rook. And it's even though black has a couple of pawns, I think white still can be comfortable with a pretty big advantage here. He should just, the only thing he has to be careful of is not to get this bishop on a4 traps, but I think white's next move is probably going to be c3, so that fear will go away. White will play bishop e3, knight d2, and just try to make use of his pieces. This is in some way a little bit like the Berlin with reversed colors because it's an endgame. And while black has a nice pawn majority here, because he doesn't have any way to challenge white's dark squared bishop, and that color complex is going to be very hard to break through. So I think white's better in this endgame. But now that we're going to get back to the main line, instead of e takes d4, black plays b5, bishop b3, and d5. D takes e5, bishop e6, knight bd2, and knight c5. So I think white's best move is c3 here. He wants to play bishop c2, and he wants to play knight d4. And with the point of knight c4 is to block up all of black's center, and then try to maybe play f4 and f5 and develop a kingside initiative. So there's a couple things black can do here. Black probably shouldn't take this bishop, because now white's going to have a very powerful bind on the dark squares. Next moves maybe something like bishop e3 or knight fd4, and this c-pawn is going to be very weak. For example, bishop e7, knight g4. I believe there was a game in this line, Friedel Kaidanov at the U.S. Championship back in, I believe it was May, at the St. Louis Chess Club. And white ended up winning that game, although black, with some help from black, I think black probably could have drawn if he had not made a mistake and time pressure in the end. But but at that point, black really has to concede that he's going to have a worse position, because as we look, sorry, I'll just go back to it real quick. This c-pawn is just going to be perpetually weak, and white will always have this open c-file to work with, and the weak c5 square. And I think white can be confident of some advantage here. So there's a couple moves here. Black can play bishop e7. Black can play bishop g4. And black can play sort of like the more aggressive move, d4. So, for example, bishop e7, white will play rook e1. Or let's say, yeah, bishop c2 first, just to keep the knight out of d3 and key lines. Castles, rook e1, and now white's really planning to play knight d4. If he plays it now, he's got to be willing to give up this pawn, which may not be so bad because he'll get a lot of play, but usually rook e1 is just a more normal thing anyway. And if black doesn't like giving white that option, he can play bishop g4 right away. So after bishop c2, castle, rook e1, bishop g4, h3, bishop h5, white will play something like knight f1, and then knight g3, looking for knight f5. And while black can try to play for d4 someday. And it's, again, just like I say about all the other Ruy-Lopez positions, a very rich position where lots of things are going on, where lots of plans can take place. And I think that black should be, in general, okay, maybe not better, but maybe slightly worse. But it's also, they're very interesting positions, and black can play them for a win, and but so can white. And it's just the kind of position that you should be happy to play chess in. So, but now I'm going to head to the main move where black plays d4 here instead of bishop e7. So there's a couple things white can do. White can play knight g5, which is a very aggressive move. It was supposed to thought to be really good. Kasparov unleashed it on somebody at some moment and won a very nice game. But at first glance, it looks stupid because black will just take the knight. But white has this point of playing queen f3, and this knight on c6 is really feeling the pain. Black plays bishop d7. Then this f7 pawn is hanging, and white is likely to get a winning attack. And if black plays king d7, well then bishop d5, and white will still end up winning the piece. Because if bishop takes d5, queen takes d5, black's going to have to give up defense of this knight, because if bishop d6, white plays knight e4, double attacking the queen from the bishop and the knight. Something like queen takes e5, knight takes c5 check, and now the king really has to move, and white takes c6, and black's completely falling apart. So Black can't really save this knight. One other thing I should point out, after bishop d5, if black tries to play knight takes e5, then white can throw this intermediate move in, bishop takes e6 check, and followed up next move by taking the rook on a8. Sorry, wrong arrow. So the main move here actually is castle and queenside. And then bishop takes e6, fe6, queen c6, queen e5, b4, and now queen d5 is a very powerful move. Queen takes d5, e takes d5, b takes c5, d takes c3, knight b3, d4. And there's been a lot of analysis on this variation. I believe the current state is that people are thinking it's about equal. Black currently has 2 pawns for a piece, and he's maybe ready to pick up a third on c5 sometime. And those 2 pawns are extremely powerful, extremely dangerous, and there's lots of very interesting games that have happened in this variation. I know Grandmaster Julio Becerra, who does lectures here for chess.com and articles, he's quite a master at this for the black side. I've seen him win. I saw him win a very nice game against Ron Burnett in this line once. So I would check that game out if you're interested. It's a very interesting end game, but I think on the whole, black should be okay. So there's different ways of playing, though. I recently played a game against Grandmaster Viktor Nikolevsky as white here, and I played bishop takes e6, knight takes e6, c takes d4, knight c takes d4, and knight e4. So white's just trying to capitalize really quickly on black's lack of development, bishop e7. And now the main move here is a4, and white's supposedly slightly better, but black shouldn't have too many issues. But I played bishop e3, which is a more aggressive move, attacking the knight. If knight takes f3, queen takes f3, then black really is in trouble because white will quickly play rook fd1, rook a c1, and black's under an enormous amount of pressure and has very little development. So black plays knight f5, which is the best move. He's not letting white's queen get developed with tempo, and he's threatening to take on e3, shattering white's pawn structure. So here I actually played queen c2, allowing that. If knight takes e3, then queen c6 check is very strong. So black has to castle first. But here I played rook ad1, and he still plays knight takes e3, fe3, queen c8, and he's shattered my pawn structure, but he's opened up my rook on the f-file, and there's other weaknesses. And after knight d4, I think he has to fix it a little bit because knight f5 and knight c6 both would be very powerful moves if I could play them, so he probably just has to get rid of this knight. However, though, this pawn structure is still pretty mediocre for white because of the backward pawn on d4, and the pawn on e5 can always be hit by f6. And I think black in the long term has better pawn structure, although there's definitely other stuff in the meantime, like the game continued knight g3, and then c6, knight f5, rook e8, rook f3, and white developed some initiative. It was a very interesting middle game later on, and I ended up winning with the tactic. I'll show it real quick, although it's not, I guess, totally relevant. a3, rook e d8 is a powerful move. He's trying to play c5. b4, a5, queen d2, protecting the b pawn. Takes, rook a2, queen f4. So black can't take on b4 just yet because of queen g5 with the fork. So black plays rook da8, trying to trade off some of white's rooks. If black can play rook a1 and harass the king, it'd be good for him. So white plays h4, giving the king some room in such a situation. And here Mikolevsky blundered with rook 8a3, allowing a cute tactic, knight h6 check. If queen takes h6, queen f7 is going to be checkmate. And g takes h6 is what happened in the game. Queen g3 check, and the next move, white will take this rook off and be up in exchange. So that's sort of a kind of characteristic way of this line where white plays bishop e3. He will have some initiative, but maybe in the long run weak pawn structure. And that's sort of something that can be seen in a less conventional Ruy-Lopez, like the open Ruy. So now I'm going to shift gears and go to the martial attack, which starts out a little bit more like an open Ruy. After knight f6, castle, bishop e7, rook e1, b5, bishop b3, castle, c3, d5. So white plays e takes d5, knight takes d5, knight e5, knight e5, rook e5. And now I know knight f6 is a possibility here, but for some reason I don't think it was supposed to be good, so I'm just going to look at the main line of c6. So white can play here d3 or d4. After d3 we can get an endgame that I alluded to in the last video, like such. Rook e1, queen h4, g3, queen h3, queen f3, bishop f5, bishop d5, cd5, queen d5, rook a d8, queen g2, queen g2, king g2, bishop d3. Or black has excellent compensation for the pawn, and while he's maybe slightly worse, can probably hold a draw. But there's other ways of playing for white and for black. White can try playing d4 instead, and after bishop d6, rook e1, queen h4, g3. There's a couple things white can do here, but I think getting popular now is bishop e3, and then bishop g4. And now it should be pointed out that white has to be very careful here. But if he plays queen d3, he's okay because he can play queen f1 in the event of bishop f3. So, for example, if bishop f3, queen f1, queen h5, you might think that black's really gained something by putting this bishop on f3, but in reality, it's actually just going to get kicked away by knight d2, and white is going to have an extra pawn now, and black's compensation has really dawdled. So, after bishop e3, black will play maybe rook e8, and then there's many ideas here for black. I saw a game not too recently. It was Anand against Aronian, and Aronian beat him very nicely, where he came up with this idea of playing rook a7 and then rook e7, and really forgetting any attack, but just trying to play on the e file. Like I believe in that game, Aronian even just played rook a7 in this position, and after and soon he played rook e8 and rook e7, and had just took complete control of the only open file, and white had to realize that his majority on the queen side was completely immobile and not particularly useful. So the thing about the Marshall is it's very hard. Basically, white's best hope is to play a slightly better endgame, or manage to get a pawn up position. It's still very hard to win, and usually black can hold a draw. And meanwhile, black, if his attack succeeds, is very happy because that usually means checkmate. So this is one reason that white will often avoid the Marshall attack, and for that reason here often plays a move like h3, and then d6, c3 will transpose back into the sort of closed lines we were looking at. Another variation is a4. I believe bishop b7 is black's best move. Should also point out after h3, bishop b7 is also possible. c3, d5. I saw a game here. Matikosyan, underneath Matikosyan, an Armenian in an IM against Julio Becerra, and Becerra completely killed him. I think in this position here, black can play knight f4 and get excellent compensation for his sacrificed pawn because white's king side is so weak, and black is ready to plop a knight down on d3, preventing all of white's development. In the aforementioned game, Matikosyan-Becerra, Matikosyan did not take this pawn on d5. He played d3. But as I talked about before, in the sort of like the closed Ruy-Lopez, playing d5 is often a very powerful thing for black, and here black didn't even have to waste the move playing d6. So I think black already has no problems, and he's got a happy position. He ended up winning the game very convincingly. So that's sort of the Marshall. It's, again, if you want to play any of these openings for either color, you really are going to have to research them, but I'm just trying to give a basic idea of some of the general principles and moves that both sides can be playing. So now I'm going to shift gears once more and go to the Archangel, which is characterized as follows: bishop b3, bishop c5. This is a favorite of Grandmaster Alex Onishuk, one of the strongest players in the United States. And white's best way of playing against this, I believe, is a4 immediately, because if white plays c3, d6, d4, bishop b6. I don't think black has too many problems. One of the main points is now white's big try, a4, to break up the queenside. Black can mate with bishop g4, and his rook is now protected, and he's brought this bishop to its optimal square. And while we saw that the d4 pawn was weak in the cases where black could play bishop g4 earlier, now that was with black's bishop on e7. With black's bishop on b6, it's going to be much worse. So a4 is the best move because now black doesn't have time to move this bishop to g4 because he hasn't played d6 yet. So he has to play rook b8, a takes b5, a takes b5, c3, d6, d4, bishop b6, knight a3. So black's best here is to let white take the pawn, castles, knight takes b5, and bishop g4. And white is under some serious pressure here, absolutely. And if he plays d5, something like knight e7, this pawn e4 is weak and it's not immediately clear what to do about it. For example, bishop c2, I saw a game in this line, and black plays queen e8, attacking the knight, c4, and then he went knight takes e4, bishop takes, and f5. And next move he plays e4, attacking this pinned knight. And he got a big attack and got his piece back. So white, d5 is a move, but it's not that great. So e4 is threatened in some lines, although if black tries to take e4 right now, he's going to run into some serious issues with bishop g5. So bishop g4 though, and now there's a couple moves. There's bishop c2, after which ed4 is okay, and then cd4 and d5. Another way of playing is just d5 right away, just trying to really break open the center while white is not well prepared to deal with it. Another way to play is rook e1, after which ed4, cd4, bishop f3. If queen f3, knight d4, black has no problems. So g takes f3, knight takes d4, knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, bishop f7, rook f7, queen d4. White took f7 because if he takes back on d4 now, rook takes b3. Black took the piece back, equal material. White's got a messed up king. But after bishop f7, rook f7, queen d4, let's say knight h5 from black, white's king is always under attack, and it's not really a pleasant position to play for white, even if he does have an extra pawn. So this is sort of a kind of theme of the archangels. Black will often sacrifice a pawn to open up white's position. So for all you attacking players, the archangel might be a good opening for you. So another move here is bishop e3, and there's some other key lines. For example, now ed4, cd4, knight e4. So if bishop d5 now, queen e8 is quite strong, I think, just holding the two knights. And if white plays queen c2 to ratchet up the pressure, I think black's best move is to take f3, because if he plays knight b4 right away, which he's going to do next, queen e4, if black plays queen b5 now, white will take on g4. And if black plays bishop f3, white takes the queen, and then plays bishop takes f3, and either way he ends up with an extra piece. So after bishop takes f3, g takes f3, knight b5, or knight b4, queen takes e4, queen takes b5, black's totally fine. White's pawn structure has been ruined. And if after bishop takes f3, bishop takes c6, black can play queen e6. And he's threatening queen g4, queen g4, which is going to be very powerful. And although it looks like it just loses because of g takes f3, black now has queen g6 check, king h1, knight g3 check, and, well, the joke's on white. So those were some of the other variations of the Ruy-Lopez that were less conventional. And for the next lecture, I'm going to actually bring in some specific games that were played by strong players and go over them. And it'll most likely be games from the more closed Ruy-Lopez to give those kind of positional ideas. So thanks. Until then, this is Sam Shanklin signing off.